Member for Scarborough Rouge Park.
I move second reading of Bill 104, an act to proclaim Tamil Genocide Education Week.
Mr. Thanikasalam has moved second reading of Bill 104, an act to proclaim Tamil Genocide Education Week. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the member has 12 minutes for his presentation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There are memories that are etched deep into our hearts. They change us, shape us, and haunt us all our lives. We think that not speaking about them can erase their existence, but the reality is they become a part of us. This memory is one of such. When I was a young boy of about 5 years old, there was a young girl who lived on our street, who I fondly called as Akka, a term to respect reserved for an elder sister. I remember she used to braid her hair into 2 pigtails and wore a pottu every day, a black dot between her eyebrows, to ward off evil and protect her. This Akka came to my house every day to collect fragrant jasmine flowers for offering at the temple. I still remember the day vividly when artillery shelling had increased in our town and we took cover in underground bunkers. I was with my mother at that time in a bunker and we heard a loud noise. This noise startled me and I tightly grasped my mother's hand. After the shelling stopped, everyone in the neighborhood came together to discuss what happened. At that time, I remember seeing that Akka's mother was running around in despair. In a little while, I saw a sight I have unsuccessfully tried to forget. Pieces of human flesh were being taken on a small truck. My mother quickly covered my eyes and hurried me home. Few days later, I noticed that this Akka no longer came to pick flowers. I later heard, among hushed whispers, that this Akka was among those who perished in the artillery shellings that day. Even the pottu could not protect her, and the fragrance has left my memory of jasmine flowers. Sadly, stories of such are not an anomaly. Madam Speaker, it is my honor to rise today to speak to my private member's bill, the Tamil Genocide Education Week. This year marks the 10th year anniversary of the horrors of Mullivaikal. In the May of 2009, dubbed May Massacre, the Sri Lankan government engaged in a heightened program of genocide marked by indiscriminate shellings towards civilians, targets such as government-declared no-fire zones and hospitals, cluster bombings, chemical bombings, abductions, rape, murders, and denial of food and medicine to Tamils in Mullivaikal. The population of Vanni was 429,059 persons in October 2008. The total number of people who were admitted into Sri Lankan government control after the May massacre was 282,380 according to UN update as of July 10, 2009. This means that 146,679 people were not accounted for. To put that into context, that is more than the total number of students that attend York University and all the 3 campuses of University of Toronto. This number is in accordance with local estimates of the death toll of the May massacre. Many others were also displaced, injured, and physically assaulted. Genocide is defined by the 1928 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Sadly, each of these acts in the definition of genocide were carried out against Tamils by the Sri Lankan government. Tamils were killed to the tune of 145,000 in Mullivaikal in 2009. They were seriously injured and they live with the mental trauma of their living nightmare. Conditions of starvation were inflicted upon them to bring about their physical destruction. According to the UN Office of the Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator, at least 5,000 metric tons of food is needed to feed 300,000 people for a month. However, Sri Lankan government only allowed 3% of food into the government-declared safe zone to feed the population of 300,000 people. Imposing measure intent to prevent births within the group that are part of a program of gendercide and conducted in order to decrease the growth of the group. In 2013, health workers forced surgically implanted birth control to Tamil women in the northern province, or they faced the denial of treatment at selected hospitals. Tamil children have also been taken from their native homes and structurally resettled into Sinhalese-speaking areas. These are all conditions that meet the criteria for genocide. However, a program of structural genocide has been occurring for decades prior. Prior to independence, there were 3 kingdoms in the island. Tamils and Sinhalese have lived separately under their own governance. 3 kingdoms were merged for administrative convenience by the British. Ceylon was granted its independence in 1948 by Great Britain. Following independence, the government of Ceylon, mainly made up of Sinhala people, enacted multiple laws and policies that disenfranchised Tamil in order to gain 2/3 parliamentary majority and proclaimed Sinhala as the official language of Ceylon. Cultural strongholds were also targeted, an important part of structural genocide. In 1981, the Jaffna Public Library was burnt down by Sri Lankan state. Over 95,000 unique and irreplaceable Tamil palm leaves, manuscripts, parchments, books, magazines, and newspapers were destroyed. Furthermore, anti-Tamil pogroms began to break out in Sinhala majority areas. These resulted in the horrific killings of hundreds of Tamils and left many others without homes and businesses. 3,000 Tamils were killed and over 150,000 became refugees, many fleeing to the country to India and West, including Canada, during the 1983 riots. War, violence, and structural genocide continued for decades onwards. Despite attempts to resolve conflict, including ceasefires, violence against the Tamils were continued and heightened in May of 2009. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and a Nobel laureate, famously said, "To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time." The final stage of genocide is the destruction of memory, the denial of wrongdoing, and the burial of evidence. Memoricide, a term coined by Mirko Grmek, is something regimes engage in order to eliminate the dark periods of history and, so to speak, rewrite history. In order to facilitate this, memorials and remembrance ceremonies were disallowed, and the history of what happened is erased or minimized. The Sri Lankan state has denied responsibility for the genocide. This has left many Tamils unable to heal and move forward. The diaspora Tamils have strongly urged their respective governments to help acknowledge the pain and suffering they have endured and have been endured by their kin. Tamils in Ontario have lost their brothers, sisters, and relatives. Many still don't know the whereabouts of them and continue to pray for their safety. This is a pain I truly understand. When I was about 6 years of age, my mother and I were walking home. Suddenly, the Sri Lankan Navy artillery shells started hitting our town. My brother was gone to the store at that time, and we feared for his safety. My mother and I both prayed with tears in our eyes that he would be brought home safely to us. Thankfully, he was. However, in those few hours, I understood the pain of not knowing whether the loved ones were safe. The Tamil community has lost a great deal, continue to being affected by these incidents. This is why this bill is even more necessary, because through this bill, the House would help in honoring the memory and naming the atrocities faced by the Tamils in Sri Lanka as genocide. Furthermore, an education week provides an opportunity to reflect on and to educate the public about the enduring lessons of the Tamil genocide and other crimes against humanity. We must always strive to create a world where principles of human rights are upheld. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, "Our lives began to end the day we become silent about things that matter." We have been entrusted with a great responsibility and belief by the citizens of Ontario to represent them. And through showing solidarity with communities that are healing collectively, we will be doing right by them. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Further debate? I recognize the member from Brampton East.
Thank you, Speaker. Varnakam. To understand the importance of recognizing the Tamil genocide, we must first understand the terrible human rights abuses the Tamil people have had to endure. For decades, the Tamil people have been subjected to an organized, state-sponsored campaign of genocide carried out by the Sri Lankan government. From the 1983 Black July genocide that took the lives of thousands of Tamils, to the bombing of orphanages like that in Sanchoile, which killed dozens of children and staff, to campaigns of sexual violence like the heinous rape of Krishanti, a 19-year-old Tamil schoolgirl who was abducted and gang-raped by Sri Lankan soldiers. When her worried family went out to look for her, they too were murdered. The story of Krishanti's family is just one of the tens of thousands of Tamils who were disappeared by the Sri Lankan government, abducting them in the middle of the night by white vans, never to be seen again. And as secretly as Tamils were abducted, so too were their bodies disposed of, with mass graves being found throughout Sri Lanka, with hundreds of bodies found within, like those in Samani. These disappearances even included journalists, like Taraki Savaram, whose killers to this day remain free. The violence the Tamil people have had to face is more than just direct and physical. The Sri Lankan state has made attempts to wipe out the culture, language, and ways of life of the Tamil people through cultural genocide, an attack that is apparent with the burning of the Jaffna Public Library, which resulted in the destruction of ancient Tamil manuscripts, books, historic documents, and more. All this violence culminated on May 18th, 2009, and is why we recognize that day as Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day, where thousands of Tamils were murdered in one day by the Sri Lankan government. The trauma of these decades of violence continue to impact the Tamil community. Trauma is intergenerational. That means the next generation of Tamils will experience the pain of those before them. And that is why it is so important to name the Tamil genocide, recognize it, and continue to remember it, so Tamils and the Tamil people can share the memories of those whose lives were lost, to make sure the stories are told, and to educate the community for generations to come, because we can only heal from trauma once we confront it. And more, Tamil Genocide Education Week is important for all Ontarians, for all Canadians, even those who are not Tamil, so that we can better understand the injustices that our Tamil neighbors have gone through and continue to go through. And that's why today it would be a real tribute to the community if we could pass this bill as soon as possible, so the Tamil people know that Ontario stands with them. Tamil ena alipai nenaivu kolvam. We remember the Tamil genocide. Vanakkam.
Further debate? I recognize the member from King Vaughan.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the member from Scarborough Rouge Park for his leadership in bringing forth this bill. I also want to thank him for inviting me to his riding a few months ago. We met with the Tamil Youth Council and other leaders, young leaders from Canada's Tamil community. Some of them are with us today to express the solidarity that we have and the responsibility as a government and as parliamentarians to never forget the sacrifices and those who have lost their life. And the member has spoken so brilliantly about the need to remember, the need to never forget the great atrocities committed over the successive 30 years of the Civil War. And Madam Speaker, I met a lady named Pamela, and who is in this chamber as we speak, and her father. And she shared with me a story that is most moving. Having spoken to her young 10-year-old, a young cousin who they just spoke, had a normal discussion with the family as we do every day with our friends and our family. And hours later, the infamous white van, a tool used by the state to perpetuate acts of human rights abuses against Tamils, the minority community in Sri Lanka, abducted this young man and thereafter killed him. And these are the stories that are far too often define the history of the Tamil genocide. And it is incumbent on political leaders to name it and to shame it, to acknowledge the genocide that was committed, to acknowledge and recognize. As Benjamin Dix said, the communications manager for the United Nations in Sri Lanka between 2004 and 2008, quote, "It is very fair to say that the Sri Lankan army committed genocide. The atrocities in Sri Lanka were definitely towards ethnic cleansing." Speaking in 2009, after recent violence, the UN spokesperson in Colombo, Gordon Weiss, stated there was, quote, "large-scale killings of civilians, including more than 100 children." Madam Speaker, there may be foreign governments and foreign agents who choose not to recognize this evil for what it is, but we know it to be genocide, and we have a duty, a moral duty, to say so. Madam Speaker, as a progressive conservative in this legislature, I benefited greatly from speaking with many of the young leaders who were heroic and courageous in sharing their story. But as a conservative and as a former political advisor to the 22nd Prime Minister Stephen Harper, I'm proud, Madam Speaker, that it was that government, the first government at the Commonwealth Summit, who said no to the regime in Colombo, who said for the first time in the history of the Commonwealth, we will boycott the Commonwealth Summit because it was being hosted in a country that advances state persecution for minorities, including Tamils. It was Prime Minister Mulroney, who is the father of our Attorney General, but it was Prime Minister Mulroney who, during the worst of the civil wars, opened the doors in this country as a place of safe refuge for those that needed support and safekeeping in this country. And so, Madam Speaker, as a Conservative, but most importantly as a Canadian, I am proud that we have legislation that is here to educate the next generation, but also here to remember the sacrifices and atrocities committed onto the generation behind us. I want to reaffirm my support for this bill, and I want to express gratitude to the member from Scarborough Rouge Park, who has been a leader in this respect, and not just for Tamils, but for Holocaust and genocide remembrance for all communities. He has spoken so passionately and brilliantly on this issue, and I just want to express my gratitude on behalf of all people, especially those younger Canadians and Ontarians who choose to learn from our history so we do not repeat it. Madam Speaker, thank you, and thank you to the member.
Before we continue, just a reminder to all those in the galleries, we're very appreciative that you are here, but we would ask that you not participate in the debate by clapping. But I continue with further debate. The members from Beaches East York.
Thank you, Speaker. It's really important that we have genocide education because it is often in the interests of states who perpetrate these acts to deny them, and trauma is very, very difficult to speak about. So I want to read into the record some of the stories that were told to me when I did the Mosaic Institute's Perception versus Reality of Imported Conflict in Canada. The first by a Tamil woman who was 34 at the time I spoke to her, came to Canada at 16. One night on Christmas Eve when I was 10, we were at my aunt's house chit-chatting when a bomb fell on the roof of our house. The bomb hit one of the big beams and exploded outward, so we were not killed, but the neighbor who had looked outside when she heard the planes was killed instantly. I have scars on my arm and legs from shrapnel, and my aunt is still carrying shrapnel inside her. My cousin needed a skin graft, and she still can't walk properly. She has poor circulation. For years, I suffered from PTSD. When I cycled to school and heard thunder, I thought it was explosions. At school, I would scream and need to be cuddled, even here, and we had no counselors to provide us with emotional help. The second from a Tamil woman, 23, who came to Canada at 2. A lot of houses of people we knew were bombed. My cousins were tortured and captured by the Sri Lankan government, and one of my cousins is still missing. These were my first cousins. At Mulivaikal, we had family friends end up in the internment camps and survived the end. My immediate family managed to survive, but all of our property was taken. I refrained from reading the news because I deal with individual trauma on a daily basis. From a woman who was 30 when she spoke to me and came to Canada at 10. My dad went to a meeting and surrendered his weapons. When the van he was in was ambushed, they torpedoed it and killed almost everyone who was in it. There was one survivor who was in the bushes and they thought he was dead, but he saw what happened. One person was chopped up while he was still alive. In my father's case, they poured acid on him to burn his body. We don't know if he was alive when they poured the acid on him, but that meant we had no body to bury. And the fourth, my parents dealt with war trauma, but also the trauma of leaving their families and everything behind. My father was carrying war trauma, but also regrets for leaving his family behind. I noticed that a lot of Tamil dads were emotionally and mentally absent, but trauma drove many to alcoholism, and that was a real problem. These are the stories that people live with, the stories that they continue to hold in their hearts, and it is why we need to educate everybody as to what trauma exists and why it's there. Thank you.
Further debate? Further debate? I recognize the member from Mississauga Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. It is my honor to speak to Bill 104, an act to proclaim Tamil Genocide Education Week, introduced by my friend and colleague, the member from Scarborough Rouge Park. Thank you for sharing your very moving and heartbreaking testimonial with us. I know that wasn't easy to do. To grow up in Canada means to grow up in a country that embraces diversity and welcomes all cultures and ethnicities. We are lucky to call home a place where we can live freely without fear of persecution, a place where the atrocities of genocide are quite simply unthinkable. Unfortunately, the deliberate killing of ethnic groups of people and the destruction of their culture continues to be a very real and very recent reality faced by thousands of Tamils in Sri Lanka. For nearly 30 years, the country was in the grips of a savage civil war that claimed the lives of thousands. While the world stood by, widespread shelling targeted Tamil civilians, merciless attacks were carried out against innocents, and families were torn apart while hospitals were bombarded, all while humanitarian assistance was denied. What I just described was the daily reality in Sri Lanka just 10 years ago, an island nation in the Indian Ocean that endured 3 decades of a brutal civil war that took more than 100,000 lives. It seems unimaginable that such a massacre could have been unfolding for so long, just halfway across the world. Yet this is exactly what happened. There are few words, if any, that can really capture the kind of devastation and crimes against humanity that took place. But genocide is one of them, and of that, there is no doubt. In the final months alone, the civil war in Sri Lanka claimed the lives of more than 50,000 people, but this is only an estimate, but for a fraction of the true number, which is believed to be closer to over 70,000 civilians being killed in the final months of the devastating war. These attacks targeted Tamils for no other reason than that they were Tamil. It was discrimination of the worst kind, and we must never let ourselves forget what happened. This is why Bill 104 is so important, because it will remind us of the tragic cost of war and of the precious lives lost. It will remind us that we must never stand by as a genocide unfolds. In declaring the week of May 18th to be Tamil Genocide Education Week, this bill will memorialize all the innocent lives that were taken. It will make sure that current and future generations reflect on and educate the public about the enduring lessons of the Tamil genocide and other crimes against humanity. Ontario is home to one of the world's largest Tamil diaspora communities, many of which live in the city of Mississauga. I've heard from many of my Mississauga Centre constituents that they support the recognition of this historically significant event, which has recently impacted an entire nation. We must never allow the horrors of war and the failings of humanity to be forgotten with the passage of time. We must respect and honor the casualties of this atrocity by working together for a better future, a better Ontario, a better Canada, and a better humanity. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For the debate, I recognize the member from Toronto Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. Vanakkam. I'm humbled to rise in the House this afternoon to speak to this important bill. And I first want to start by thanking the member for Scarborough Rouge Park for introducing this bill, and to all of my colleagues who have spoken so eloquently to it today. My community includes St. Jamestown and Regent Park, which are home to many Tamil constituents. In fact, these neighbourhoods, which are just a few blocks from this building, are the place where many Tamils settled when they first came to Canada. And while many folks have come as refugees, an entire generation of children has grown up in Toronto Centre and call our neighbourhoods home. Jarvis Collegiate is a high school in my riding and has many Tamil teenagers go through its doors and through our public education system. Tamils Information is a local community newspaper that is based in my riding and creates a wonderful publication available to the Tamil Canadian community across Ontario and beyond. And while I'm grateful that many Tamil Canadians are able to call Toronto Centre home, I know that the history of their move to Canada is painful and drowned in violence and blood. The people of Tamil Eelam have suffered, and the history of mass disappearances and killings in Sri Lanka paints a dark picture of neglect and violence. This May 18th, just a few short days away, marks the 10th anniversary of the Mullawakkal massacre at the end of the decades-long civil war in Sri Lanka. Thousands of innocent Tamils, men, women, and children, were killed during the war, and for many, violence and persecution has persisted in Sri Lanka. As a woman with mixed Indigenous and settler heritage, I can relate to the struggles for self-determination and the fight to have histories of genocide, assimilation, and oppression recognized. I've seen the trauma that years of colonialism and cultural violence has brought to Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples across this country. My own family has a history of adoption on both sides, and it's a testament to what happens when communities are shattered and when people are forced to leave their homes and their cultures behind. Speaker, I know that our communities are strong and resilient and will not give up the fight for peace and for justice. And that's why I'm proud today to stand in support of this motion to create an education week on Tamil genocide. And of course, I wish there was room to also explicitly name May 18th as Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day. Again, I'm so proud that our caucus and I support this motion and will continue supporting the Tamil Canadian community all across Toronto, across Ontario, across Canada, and across the diaspora internationally. Thank you so much. Miigwech.
For the debate, I recognize the member from Mississauga East Cooksville.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Today I rise in this House to support a private member's bill brought forward by my friend and colleague from Scarborough Rouge Park. I have received several emails and calls from members of the Tamil community asking to support Bill 104, the Tamil Genocide Education Week Act. Aina is one of the many people from the Tamil community who has reached out to me, and it is my honor that she is here among us this afternoon. Aina is a Tamil youth born and raised in Ontario from the Canadian Tamil youth. She wrote to me and said that, and I quote, "As youth, our pain, trauma, and passion of seeking for justice are what keep us united." The Tamil community continue to have families in the northeast region of Sri Lanka suffering the atrocities of the Sri Lanka state and living the ongoing consequences of the 30-year-long conflict. Madam Speaker, as Ontario is home to the largest Tamil community, this bill is important for the future generations. She later mentioned how, and I quote, "It will ensure that the stories that are currently only passed on verbally are shared through formal educational avenues to not only the Tamil community, but all residents within Ontario." Madam Speaker, this pain and trauma of such atrocities are intergenerational. This education process will also create an open space for other communities to come together to share their stories and struggles. The recognition of the Tamil genocide and further education about it will serve to be an enormous milestone in this healing process. Recognizing such atrocities can help strengthen the Tamil community. This bill will provide Ontario with a space to encourage the sharing and understanding of others' struggles and bring forth a stronger sense of unity amongst us all. The goal and hope is that with the education and awareness, such horrific patterns in history will finally stop repeating themselves. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Further debate? I recognize the member from Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you, Speaker. And I want to thank the member from Scarborough Rouge Park for bringing this bill forward. I'm honored to stand today in support of this motion because this is such an important step to learn and understand and recognize the experience of the Tamil community, as well as the many other communities that have lived through such atrocities around the world who now make up the very multicultural fabric of Ontario. This motion is so important for my constituents in the Tamil community in Scarborough Southwest, for those stories that I listened to. I was able to learn about the trauma many of them and their families had to live through. But another reason why I support this motion is because I, as a Bangladeshi Canadian, understand the pain and the suffering of my family members and community who have suffered such horrific injustices. The people of Bangladesh experienced one of the most brutal genocides in history, where 3 million people were killed during its War of Independence, a big majority of whom were unarmed civilian men, women, and children. Hundreds of thousands of women were raped, many of whom were kept in makeshift prisons and raped for months. Speaker, thousands of these women were kept naked so that they won't be able to use the clothes to commit suicide after being unable to bear the pain and suffering. And I want to share a story of a Tamil girl, Krishanti Kumaraswamy, who I believe may have gone through something similar. A 19-year-old Tamil girl, schoolgirl, who was gang raped and murdered on 7th August 1996 by 6 Sri Lankan army soldiers. She went missing on her way home after writing her exams and was last seen alive at the Kaitati army checkpoint in Jaffna. When her worried parents and brother went in search of Krishanti, they were also murdered. In July 1998, Sri Lankan Army Lance Corporal Sumarant Rajabakshi was facing a death sentence for the rape and murder of the student and her family. While on trial, he also made allegation about the existence of a mass grave in Jaffna, containing the bodies of those who had disappeared in previous years. There were reports of up to 300 to 400 bodies being buried in mass graves near the village of Shamani. Speaker, these are the memories of our people, our families, our neighbors here. And that is why I, as an individual, and we all, should carry a moral obligation and sense of duty to stand against all kinds of mass killings, genocides, and atrocities. And we must unanimously, unequivocally denounce any and all acts of terrorism, atrocities, and mass killings. And I'm glad that this motion will educate our children.
Thank you. Further debate? I recognize the member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the MPP for Scarborough-Guildwood, I rise today to speak to the bill that has been put forward by my neighbouring riding, the MPP from Scarborough Rouge Park, an act to proclaim Tamil Genocide Education Week. I'd like to recognize the 10th anniversary of the Mulavakal Remembrance Day. This day marks the end of the 25-year-long civil war where thousands of innocent civilians were killed during the Tamil Genocide in Sri Lanka. Although it has been a decade since the end of the war, the wounds are still fresh. There are thousands of people from Sri Lanka now living in Ontario, and many living in our community in Scarborough, many here, in fact, listening to today's debate. A few weeks ago, I had a chance to attend a tree planting. It was done and organized by MP Gary Anandasangari as a symbol of the new life that now grows, coming out of this devastation. I had a chance to plant a white cedar to symbolize that new life and to talk about it with one of the local families. I spoke to many survivors who shared their experiences with me. They told me about the denial and about how hurtful that was to them. They told me that there was a denial of equitable education. There wasn't a level playing field, and about the devastating killings that occurred. Today, the rebuilding is still occurring in Sri Lanka. Families that have been torn apart, lives that were lost, we're still mourning that loss. We're still rebuilding physical infrastructure, social systems, political systems, education, and the economy. There is still so much work to do. But today, we remember. I want to acknowledge the tragedy and the suffering that flows from a civil war. For decades, from 1983 to 2009, thousands of people across Sri Lanka from all sides and many civilians lost their lives. On May 18, 2009, the civil war finally came to an end. The civil war in Sri Lanka caused the persecution of innocent people, displaced many, and caused many to seek refuge elsewhere. That was 10 years ago. Yet the people and communities in Sri Lanka who lost their loved ones and their livelihoods still do seek and deserve justice. So as we mark this weekend the 10 years since the ending of the war, we have to reflect on what this means, because the wounds are still fresh, and people who have lived through that trauma are still experiencing that today. It is important that we recognize the sensitivity around this issue, especially with those families who are directly impacted. And I was very touched by your personal story. The United Nations estimates that May 2009 alone, 40 to 75,000 civilians were killed. This is an absolute tragedy. Some estimates put this at a much higher number. The perpetrators deserve to be held accountable for the terrible bloodshed and the experience that was experienced in Sri Lanka. The survivors of the civil war deserve that justice. There is a large Sri Lankan community in my riding in Scarborough-Guildwood, all around Scarborough. 300,000 Tamils now call Canada their home, and many have come to put down roots in Toronto. I've been fortunate to be welcomed by these communities and have learned much. In fact, my first experience was as a student in university, where we actually created a program to have dialogue and exchange. We must continue to recognize these tragedies. Peace is fragile. It must constantly be preserved. And I want to say here that we condemn violence in any form, and for the people of Sri Lanka and those in the diaspora living in Ontario, I wish for you an enduring and lasting peace, and education provides that pathway for which generations to follow will learn. Do not repeat the mistakes of the past. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to speak to this bill. Thank you.
Further debate. I recognize the member from Markham-Stouffville.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to just say how grateful I am to the member for Scarborough Rouge Park for bringing forward this bill. Madam Speaker, whether it's the member for Parkdale High Park who brought to our attention the plight of the Tibetan people, the member for Scarborough Southwest who spoke very passionately, or the member for Scarborough Agincourt, who last week brought forward a bill about the Armenian genocide. There are those who might ask why a provincial legislature would be talking about this, but it is our responsibility as elected officials to always bring this type of injustice forward so that everybody understands the plight of peoples, and it is our job to advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. So I'm grateful for the honourable member for bringing this forward, and for all of the colleagues who have spoken to this and the colleagues who continue to fight in this legislature. My colleagues have done a good job of explaining why this is so important, but I want to just take a moment, Madam Speaker, if I can, and I hope the members will forgive me and those in the galleries will forgive me. I want to talk with pride about being a member of Parliament who has so many Tamil Canadians in his community. The Tamil people, when you look at what they have endured when they came to this country, I think you would agree with me that they are one of the most successful immigrant communities that we have ever had in this country. And despite those challenges, they are at the head of business, they are at the head of communities, they are at the head of education. Despite the challenges that they have faced, they have elected their first member of Parliament in 2011. They elected their first 2 members of provincial parliament to this legislature in this past election, Madam Speaker. And that is very important. It's very important. So I say, as we summarize this debate again, I'm grateful for the member opposite for bringing this forward. Thank you to all of those who come from my community for everything that you have done to help build not only Markham-Stouffville, but to help build a very strong and prosperous Ontario. Your efforts will not go unnoticed by the members of this legislature. Again, thank you to the member, and thank you to all the members who spoke on this motion.
The member for Scarborough Rouge Park has 2 minutes to reply.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleagues for speaking on the Tamil Genocide Education Week bill. Thank you to the members from Brampton East, King Vaughan, Beaches East York, Mississauga Centre, Toronto Centre, Mississauga East Cooksville, Scarborough Southwest, Scarborough Guildwood, and Markham-Stouffville. Thank you so much for speaking on supporting this bill. And I also want to thank everyone who supports on the bill. We will be able to recognize, if we all support this bill, we can able to recognize Tamil genocide and allow for a healing process to begin for the community. Many of the members from the Tamil community are here in these galleries, are watching this historical movement unfold. I'm sure they are extremely thankful for the support from the members of this legislature on this bill. And I would also like to extend my special thanks to all the people and organizations from across the province that have written or called me to voice their support for this bill. I have not only heard from within the Tamil community, but also from the people across Ontario of all ages, backgrounds, and religions. I hope all my colleagues to support this bill and help Tamil community come together and begin the healing process. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The time provided for private members' public business has expired. We will deal first with ballot item number 70, standing in the name of Mr. Miller, Hamilton East, Stony Creek. Mr. Miller, Hamilton East, Stony Creek has moved second reading of Bill 60, an act to amend the Ministry of Community and Social Services Act to establish the Social Assistance Research Commission. Is